Hi, the internet. My name is Ben. I've spent 16 years as an employee of the Catholic Church, including the last 3 as an assistant principal for a Catholic school, and Donald Trump made me an atheist. Welcome to part 8 of How Donald Trump Made Me an Atheist. I'm recognizing that I'm running out of shirt-tie combos that look flattering on me, so I might have to change my shtick here. It's cute you think any of those outfits were flattering on you, honey. Well, that's my blood. That's my own blood. And see, that's hurtful. Don't write that in the comments. On the last episode, I discussed how the rise of Trumpism and its reliance on faith caused me to reevaluate how I utilized faith in my own epistemic process. And so that's where that leads us today. Before we go into my full deconstruction, today we need to spend some time talking about how humans come to conclusions, how we understand God, how we understand models of reality. So let's make a big circle back to episode 2, where I talked about logical fallacies and deductive reasoning. If you don't remember it, it included a long conversation about this table here. I identified a line of thinking in my own life that employed the use of this bottom left corner to serve as an anchoring for my belief in God. And it's plainly a logical fallacy, and it was one that I was smart enough to be able to recognize at the time, so why didn't I? I set up a syllogism that looked like this. I said, premise 1, if God provides me with supernatural assistance, then I will be able to avoid sex, drugs, or alcohol. Premise 2, I was able to avoid sex, drugs, or alcohol. Conclusion, God provided me with supernatural assistance. Again, this is plainly a logical fallacy. And also, premise 1 is a bit of circular reasoning there, I think. If God provides me with supernatural assistance, the only way that really works is if the God that I defined is capable and willing of providing me with supernatural assistance, in which case the character of that God would do that thing. So there's really nothing there. But why did I fall into it in the first place? Why did I let if A, then B, B, therefore A? How did I get away with that, even in my own mind? And I think it has a lot to do with how humans operate in modeling reality. Right? This table lists conclusions that can be drawn from deductive reasoning, which is what humans use on occasion, and it's used for logical proofs and mathematical proofs, but it's not what we usually use in the day-to-day. Usually, we operate in inductive reasoning. Here's the thing. We can't operate in the natural world mostly with deductive reasoning because we don't see laws written anywhere. There aren't laws that say, if A, then B, that we can access. And to even test those out, we have to develop all of those rules ourselves. So there are only just phenomena. There are just events and observations we can make. Then we can infer possible laws and then test to see if those work. So let's give an example. Let's talk about Isaac Newton again, the OG of classical physics. He looks around and sees that all objects near the surface of the Earth fall at roughly the same rate, and he decides to have a think about that. So we'll just call that observation, that all objects near the surface of the Earth fall at the same rate, we'll call that phenomenon B. So then Newton sees that the planets move in these orderly and discernible ways, and we can actually make predictions about how they move. We'll call that C. So Newton does some math for a bit and maybe invents calculus a little bit. He might have stolen it too. And then says, well, hey, I have this idea called the universal law of gravity, and I'll also call it proposition A, so Ben can use it in a video in 300 years. And this universal law of gravity suggests that all mass in the universe is attracted to each other according to this equation I developed. And if you use that equation, it will actually explain why objects of different masses fall at the same rate near the surface of the Earth. So my proposition A explains and implies that observation B would happen. And it also would explain why the planets move in the orderly paths that they do. So it actually would also explain observation C. And also, BTW, it would make this other thing true that I'm calling phenomenon D, and it would be that if you hung a string and put like a barbell at the bottom of that string and put 2 weights near the ends of the barbell, kind of like this video that I'm probably going to show, the barbell would like twist. It would twist towards the other masses in such a way that you could actually predict how twisted the rope would get before it reached equilibrium. And no one's ever done this before, but if my proposition A is true, this phenomenon D will also be true. And also, by the way, phenomenon E is that if you use my equation, you'll be able to, in a couple hundred years, plunk a spacecraft on the surface of the moon. You could do it. That's what Isaac Newton, say. We don't have sophisticated enough instrumentation for either of those phenomena, D or E, but trust me, if you do, shit, guys, it's going to be so cool, so cool. If my proposition A is true, then D and E will also be true, and it'll be wild. It will be a wicked ride. And on Isaac Newton could go, making all sorts of testable predictions based on his proposition A. But here's the thing, we can never confirm that A is true. All we can ever do is suggest that A seems to be true because it makes testable predictions that keep becoming accurate, keep getting confirmed. So Newton's theory, proposition A, explains B and C, and it does so quite well, and then it also makes predictions D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, a whole bunch of them. And all of them turn out to be true. All of them turn out to be true. And based on deductive logic, it doesn't matter how many things Isaac Newton predicts to be the case based on his proposition A. We can never conclude that A must be true. I mean, look at the logic of it. All you're doing is saying, if A, then B, or if A, then B, and C, and D, and E, and F, and G. And all those things have to turn out to be true. That doesn't ever make A definitionally true. It just implies that we can have more confidence in it. And that's a great way to think about reality. Observe a series of phenomena, develop a framework that will make predictions about future events, test the future events, and then either amend your framework, amend your model, or discard it if it doesn't work at all. Humans of our era all basically understand this on some level, even if they couldn't articulate it as thoroughly and handsomely as I just did. But I need to be explicit here because I need to show how this leads us astray when it comes to claims about God. Prayer actually did feel really good. The sacraments were meaningful moments for me. So believers will fill those in as phenomena B and phenomena C. And then they'll build a God model that both explains those phenomena and maybe provides further predictions. Now, certainly those believers are borrowing from the model of God of their religious upbringing, if not adopting that model outright. Oftentimes you'll hear atheists say things like the God model or God has no predictive power, and that's not quite true. And I think it's a dangerous thing to say because, in fact, believers do use their God model to make predictions and predictions that come true. There's a sneaky get-out-of-jail-free card they use, and we'll get to that in a minute. But it's a sloppy turn of phrase, right? Because my God model did make predictions. I had a model of God where, okay, I have these great experiences in prayer. I have these great experiences in the sacraments. I believe God is telling me that he will provide me with supernatural assistance to help avoid sex, drugs, and alcohol. My God model just made a prediction. And then look, that prediction came to pass. So I have a God model A that explains why I feel good in prayer and feel good in the Eucharist. And then it predicted that with God's help, through prayer and devotion, I would be able to get through high school without using sex, drugs, or alcohol. And I did. So if we think this through like a scientific model, that would increase my confidence in my God model. The problem was that I didn't account for any competing models. That my God exists would be a sufficient explanation for those phenomena I just described, but so would Ben believes in his God model. That would also yield results B, C, and D. This is where likening God to a model of reality becomes tricky because the God model generally does not make predictions of objective, measurable events. Certainly not in any way like Newton's gravitation model. You could test different objects on different days with different masses on different planets, and Newton's model is going to make a prediction about the strength of the gravitational force that you can test. God models don't do anything near that testable. And where they do, they fail. Hey, why don't you like and subscribe right now? That would be swell. I'd really appreciate it. It'll help the algorithm. Help trick YouTube into thinking I'm more popular than I am. It doesn't, nothing happens to you. It's not like, there are no side effects to subscription. except that I feel better about myself. If for no other reason, I get a little pop of dopamine every time someone subscribes. So like, if you do that, you helped a random human being on the internet out a little bit. And you're a good person, so do that. Okay, so think about scientists developing scientific models like this. What if you were watching a game of chess? You were watching maybe several games of chess. Over and over and over again, you watched games of chess, but you could never talk to the participants. There is a set of rules that these players are abiding by. Now, there's a difference here because the players are abiding by the rules because the rules are imposed upon them, whereas the universe has rules that it follows because that is the way that it exists, which is different. But either way, let's continue the analogy. You could watch this game of chess, and maybe you and a team of people are watching this game and trying to determine what the rules of chess are, how the pieces are allowed to move, what the objective of the game is, how you can win, how you can draw. And you know what? You could probably get really far. You could probably construct a set of rules that really closely match reality. But it wouldn't necessarily, right? Let's take an en passant. It's a rare move in chess where a pawn actually attacks another pawn by moving diagonally behind the square of the opponent. It's really weird. I'll put a graphic up. Put a graphic up, Ben. That rule would be an exception to normal play of chess. You could watch a couple dozen games of chess and never see an en passant. And you could build a set of rules for all the pieces that wouldn't include this exception for how a pawn is allowed to move. So would your list of chess rules that existed without an en passant, would you call that model of how to play chess inaccurate? And I would say, kind of, right? It was a really good framework for the rules of chess, but it was incomplete. Sometimes believers think they do this. They think they're creating a list of rules or understandings about the divine, and they're trying to update their model. And maybe sometimes they know all the rules, sometimes they don't. They accept that there may be an en passant, a divine en passant that they are unaware of, and that they will have to amend their model of God. But I don't think so. And let's get into an example of why this analogy of saying Newton models gravity and needs to amend it sometimes, and believers model God and need to amend it sometimes, because they really don't operate the same way. So let's have a think about Einstein for a moment. Newton's model of gravitation makes nearly infinite predictions about how the world will operate, and all we need is a single counterexample, a single instance in laboratory settings where we show that Newton's model produces an inaccurate prediction, and the entire model must be deemed incorrect. And that seems like a screw job, right? Newton's gravitational model works in so many situations, but there might be this one tiny exception where it doesn't work. Calling Newton's law of gravitation the universal law of gravitation would now be an inaccurate descriptor if we found one scenario where we could repeatedly demonstrate that it wasn't accurate. It wasn't universal then. Well, Einstein did that. Einstein came along and proved that objects traveling near the speed of light do not experience gravitation in the way that Newton's model would have predicted. And he replaced Newton's equation with a more complicated but also more thorough theory of relativity. Even though Newton's model provides a really elegant solution for almost all of the day-to-day interactions we have with gravitation, we do actually know that it isn't accurate. And so humans who care about this sort of thing amended their understanding, their mental concept of what gravitation is. So again, if Newton's proposition A implies B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and J turns out to be wrong, we need to either amend A or discard it. So again, let's get this back to God models. I mentioned that I used my God model to predict certain events that came to pass, but they were all internal. They were all predictions made about me and my personal experiences, and nothing was really objective and measurable. Let's take an external, somewhat objective prediction that my God model made. Ready? Here we go. Premise 1. If the church's teaching on God's plan for relationships is accurate, then people in homosexual relationships will be unhappy, unfaithful, unfulfilled. In other words, people in homosexual relationships will not mirror the same type of love that I see in heterosexual relationships. When I was in high school, I didn't know any openly gay people. And I hadn't done a deep dive into the statistics about the fulfillment of homosexual people in relationships. I hadn't done that work. So this would actually act as a testable claim that operates outside of myself. Going to college and then beyond, I got lots of data, some anecdotal, some scholarly, and all of it seemed to suggest that my prediction was wrong. Homosexual people in relationships did in fact exhibit the same type of love that I saw in heterosexual relationships. And I also didn't see in scholarly data that homosexual persons found themselves in unfaithful, unhappy, unfulfilling relationships. So I set up an if A, then B. I got not B. I am therefore rationally bound to accept not A. Anyone who accepted A as an accurate model of reality is at a crossroads because your God model has just been falsified. Our believer, in this case me, will be facing significant cognitive dissonance now because they are rationally bound to accept not A. And A was a proposition to which they were deeply emotionally invested. So that believer has two choices. They can either reject A as they understood it and amend it, potentially, to a different version of a God model, but they would have to reject the model that they understood and the one to which they were deeply emotionally attached, or they can deny that the evidence says what the evidence says. Since the predictions of the God model are almost never quantifiable, our believer can just slide in there and say, oh no, I was wrong. My God model was right, but I was wrong in that it would predict that people would look unhappy in a survey. They are secretly unhappy and unfaithful and unfulfilled, but it just doesn't look that way. But they are, for sure. And if you think that sounds ridiculous, it is, but people did it. I struggled with it a little bit. I literally know other people who have said this, that gay people are not actually happy in gay relationships, even though they look like it. And if you make their unhappiness undetectable, you can't lose. You will always be right. So that's what I mean when I say you can reject that the evidence says what it says. The evidence says that gay people are happy in gay relationships. And theists will argue that they aren't. So anyone who does that is moving their God model to the land of unfalsifiability again. They're not making predictions about the world that are testable anymore. They thought they were, but they don't. Because anytime they run into something where their model is falsified, they just say that the evidence doesn't say that. Nope, you missed. Not really. And here's what I mean. Believers can fold or flex their understanding of God to accommodate any phenomena. But if that model never makes predictions that can actually be falsified, it has no value. What's crazy is how Catholics are tricked into doing this, tricked into thinking that they have a really decent God model and actually they have one that's completely unfalsifiable. And I struggled with labeling it as tricked, but I think it's apt. I think it's an apt descriptor. Catholics are taught Bible stories from birth, creation, Noah, Joseph and the Dreamcoat, David and Goliath. And as I've mentioned, Catholics are not required and actually discouraged from literal interpretations of especially the early stories of the Bible. Popes have gone so far as to say that believing in creationism is intellectual suicide. But that's not the impression you get as a Catholic child. We aren't taught that the version of creation in Genesis is an allegory. We aren't taught that Noah's flood is geologically demonstrated to never have happened. We aren't taught that David and Goliath is a classic hero myth. We're just told the stories, and we're told those stories every week alongside with stories about Jesus that are expected to be taken literally. And as we get older, we discover that the church never meant for us to take that early stuff literally. And so what else are you supposed to do? The only way to resolve what just happened there is to say, I guess we can alter what we think of the Bible. Our model of what the Bible is good for can be changed. And when you do that to someone who has tied the Bible to the character of God, you say, you can modify the model of God a little bit. I had a religion teacher in high school who was walking us through the story of the agony in the garden, where Jesus is aware of his impending doom, and it causes him such stress that his sweat becomes like drops of blood. And this teacher said to us, does it really matter to you if Jesus actually sweat drops of blood? Like, is that important? I was outraged. Of course it happened. It must have happened. In fact, I had read an apologetic explaining that there is a medically documented condition whereby people in extreme stressful events can have their capillaries bleed out into their sweat glands and their sweat can become like blood. I said to him, this could have happened. Why high school Ben needed it to be medically plausible, I have no idea. I mean, this is an anecdote from a book where just a couple pages earlier, Jesus magicked 5,000 loaves of bread into existence. But now we need to be tethered to reality. I mean, in another chapter or two, he's going to get tortured to death and then poof, back to life. But no, the agony in the garden needs to be medically reasonable. But here's my point, is that I don't know how many Catholics would say it is foundational to their belief that Jesus was in the garden and sweat literal drops of blood. I don't think it's many. So they have adopted their God model to suggest that even the stories in the Gospels don't have to be literally true. And this is what I mean. I mean, you get tricked into it. Catholics are not taught this understanding of the books when we're young, and it leads to outrage in high school when you learn that it doesn't have to be the case. But then you accept that your God model is changeable, and it can retreat to the land of unfalsifiability. Newton's understanding of gravity was replaced by Einstein's theory of relativity. Newton's equation still works in most instances. That understanding still works and produces predictable results, but it isn't actually the best explanation for what happened. Sitting down and thinking about your day, thinking about what you're grateful for, thinking about where you could have done things better, that's a good thing to do. And you could explain that by saying, well, I'm talking with God about my day and it makes me feel better. But there's another really good explanation for that, which is when you reflect on your decision making, you make better decisions. Meditation and metacognition provide positive results, but ascribing those results to God is an unwarranted assertion. Newton believed that gravity reached out and acted instantaneously across media. The sun was reaching out and grabbing the Earth and holding it in its orbit. And that turns out not to be true, but it's effectively true in short-range situations. We don't have to think about actually what's happening is space-time is being curved by the presence of other massive bodies in such a way that we could argue that objects are actually traveling in straight lines through curved space-time. We don't actually have to do all that thinking about it to understand what results are going to happen. I don't need to think about the fact that the reason I enjoy reflecting on my day is because when I think about my day and I evaluate my decisions, later on down the road, I can make better decisions. Or it helps me gain some closure on a situation that happened at work. Sometimes it's easier to think, I was talking to God and I like talking to God. That was never right though. Right? It might seem silly to think through the better explanation for why sitting down and thinking about your day matters. It might be easier to think, oh, I'm communing with God. But if we care about what's true, then I don't think there's any reason to believe that's what's going on. And I think that's been proven false over and over again. And if you don't, I don't know how you came to that conclusion, because every time I tried, I recognized at some point I was retreating to a land where my position couldn't be falsified. That's what I was doing, just retreating. So here's my big takeaway. So there's really two ways that theists deal with God models, and one is more intellectually honest than the other, but I don't think either one is. In the one version, they set up a God model and say, here's my God. If my God model is correct, we would get results B, C, D, E, F, and G. When G turns out to be flatly falsified, the very dishonest way is to say, no, it wasn't. Nope. Nope. It wasn't that you falsified G. It's that your data doesn't really say what you think it says. That's intellectually dishonest. The other way is to actually make a God model that adapts and say, okay, my God model was wrong. I no longer believe in God model A. Let me call it A prime. And in model A prime, I get results B, C, D, E, F, and G prime, whatever our new one was. And the reason it doesn't work like science is because eventually you're going to get to the land of the unfalsifiable. You just will. The God model never predicts things that happen in reality in a way that everyone agrees is true. There's nothing quantitative about any God model that has ever borne out to be true. And so when atheists say God doesn't make predictions about reality, that's sloppy. God doesn't make quantifiable, measurable predictions about reality, and that is true. That was fun. I enjoyed that. All right. Next time we talk about why it is that my explanation for the deistic version of God, how I came to the conclusion that God must exist. Yeah, it was bad. Okay, bye.